And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. I am your host, James Just. With me today is Jason McPhee of the Knuckleheads of Liberty. You know, Jason, it's been an interesting last couple of weeks. So we're going to back up 2 weeks. And, Qatar gave Trump a plane. Well, let's be clear. They didn't give Trump a plane. They gave the United States government a plane. And I think this was the whole big brouhaha, right? Over the media and the Democrats. They all tried to make this assertion that Qatar was giving Trump the plane, rather than he's giving the U.S. government a plane. And we all know this is well established, even during his first chance in office, right? That these kind of gifts are given to the office, not the person. They stick to the office or they stick to the government, you know. So I don't get it, Jason. I don't get all the brouhaha, why everybody had to go off and pretend to be upset over this thing, right?
Yeah, it does seem like it's a little overblown, but I gotta say, it does feel like, we're not in need of planes from other countries. So that does seem a little bit silly, the idea that that we need gifts of planes. But beyond that, one of the things that I had heard on this story too is that the idea that this would be guaranteed to go to the Trump library. And if that's the case, then it does feel a little bit like it could be a bit of a personal gift if that's the case.
Yeah, but we've had enough presidential libraries to know that if they wanted to give the plane to the presidential library, they just do it after he left office, right? There's no need to do it now. It's a wink, wink, nod, nod. Yeah, we'll take care of you later. That's how it's been done, right? Essentially, you almost kind of prefer it out in the open, right? Rather than the wink, wink, nod, nod. And you pay off the presidential library, you donate money, you donate $1 billion to the Obama library that still is not built. These these type of things, right?
Must be a permit issue.
And so I just don't get the phony outrage. It's such a simplistic thing. The way these things work is so well known that the outrage just seems phony to me. It's just one of those things where the media and I don't want to call them anti-Trumpers, but the Democrats or whatever, they're just so reflective. Something happens, and so they're just going to reflectively say, it's the most terrible thing ever. And it's just a stupid plane that no one's going to care about in 6 months. Yeah. And I don't understand that.
Well, it does feel like the outrage was a little more overblown in his first time in office. I mean, I remember them having outrage about things like he had 2 scoops of ice cream when everybody else had 1. That was literally a story in the news. And I mean, and there was another story about how Trump had a bigger salt shaker than everybody else at the table. And I mean, it's just like the stuff that they were getting, that was kind of the definition of TDS, I felt like. I remember there was even a story that the media doctored to make it look like he was feeding fish koi with the president of Japan or the prime minister of Japan, and they were feeding the food, and then they showed President Trump just throw all the food in, and they made it look like he just couldn't follow any protocols, but they literally panned in to show him doing it. But when you saw the entire video, when people went back and looked at the entire video, they saw the Prime Minister of Japan first throw all the food in, and then Trump was literally just following
Just doing what, this is how you do it, right? So you throw stuff in.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So how do we know when people are really upset these days, when there's something genuine to be upset about, when we're getting upset over, it's a goofy gift, but it's just a goofy gift, right? And Qatar has plenty of money. It's not going to, a $400 million plane isn't really going to move the needle on the U.S. It's just not enough money, to move the needle on U.S. policy. It's just not enough. It's just one of these things. They've got an extra plane. We all shake hands and you go about your separate way. And in 6 months, we all forget about it. That's what's going to happen.
Well, it does feel like Qatar needs its own Doge if they're handing us $400 million planes.
That's a whole different issue, right? Whether Qatar is what they're doing with all that oil money, they're just kind of packing it away in the ruling class. And I suppose the average person in Qatar gets lots of benefits, but the working immigrants in Qatar are not treated very well. And so there's this. And again, if you're going to get upset, let's get upset about some real human issues rather than a goofy plane.
Well, and I do think it's a good lesson for, just libertarian principles. If your government is it has money to hand out gifts to people, then your government is too big. So that's just a, if you have that as a basic principle, I think you'll do okay.
Yeah, it's one thing if they're giving away a surplus plane, but it doesn't seem to me like that's a surplus plane. Yeah. So more than one thing can be true at the same time. It can be a goofy gift and not understand it, but also don't make it a big, huge ordeal when it's not. I think is kind of where we're going at about that. So Richard Fields has something to say about libertarian-ish people in Congress. So let's see what Richard's got to say this week.
Hi, this is Richard Fields with this week's Report from the Fields. Outside of Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, Senator Mike Lee of Utah is probably one of libertarians' most favorite senators. On economic and regulatory issues, he's excellent. He's in favor of balanced budgets and federal budgets and limiting the size of government to bring them about. He's often one of the few who vote against the omnibus spending bills that include every Congress critter's pork barrel project. As is fitting for a senator from a Western state, he wants to reduce unnecessary regulation on fossil fuels and subsidies for wind and solar, sell public lands, rein in the Endangered Species Act when it interferes with property rights and land control enabled by the Antiquities Act. He rejects the theory that climate change is caused by humans and supports withdrawing from the Paris Accord and the imposition of carbon taxes. He drafted a bill repealing Obamacare. He supports Congress reasserting its power over making war and the feds preempting local and state control over election rules. Unlike most Republicans, he supports liberalizing immigration by reducing country caps on issuing green cards and raising the caps for family-based green cards. He would like to make immigration an easier process and more based on merit. He voted against Trump's claiming a national emergency to build the border wall. So far, so good. But what's this? For the third time, Lee has introduced something called the Interstate Obscenity Definition Act, or IODA. For literally a couple of centuries, the United States has been struggling to overcome its prudish, puritanical roots when it comes to sex. Through legislation and court decisions, we've come to a point where pretty much everyone, except maybe the Mormons and the Baptists and the like, are reasonably comfortable with how much sexuality is allowed in mass media and the internet. I could get into the details of how IODA further criminalizes the expression of anything sexual and how the passage of it will provide fodder for First Amendment challenges for years to come. Suffice it to say that restriction of pornography is empirically not correlated with less rape and sexually related violence. Quite the opposite. If pornography is made a crime, it is decidedly a consensual crime for all involved. Making consensual crimes illegal takes law enforcement resources away from combating actual crimes of violence, theft, and fraud. This law would federalize obscenity law by overcoming the community standards provision from current law. In effect, the community standards of Mormon Utah or Southern Baptist Alabama would thus become the community standards of New York and Hollywood. Mike Lee understands the problems with federal law usurping local law on economic issues. Is it too much of a stretch for him to also apply the same logic to cultural mores? Or is he just catering to his Mormon constituency in Utah? I'm Richard Fields, and that's this week's Report from the Fields. See you again next week.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I think we know the answer to this is that he's catering, right, to his constituency. He's saying, look, I tried, nothing I can do, so at least he can go, at least I tried. And whether we know it's not going to pass. It's the third time. He knows it's got no chance of getting through, but he's, like many things happen in Congress, are done just so that he can have a campaign speech, campaign flyer, whatever, campaign commercial back home. And that's what this is. And I think it's fairly clear. It's pathetic, but it is what it is, right?
Yeah, that's a sad thing too, because you see a lot of speeches on the floor of Congress where you literally see nobody around except for the guy who's speaking, which just kind of screams, "Hey, look, this is just a photo op and nothing else." So
Yeah, that happens in hearings all the time, right? Where you've got 4 people in a hearing, and realistically, they just get there and they give their 30-second campaign spot. So, they talk for 5 minutes so they can find something out of there for the 30-second campaign spot. And that's what it happens. They go, we fought for whatever mindless, knuckleheaded thing they're advocating for that day. But they can say, look, I fought for it. Yeah, they didn't have any chance of doing it. They knew they didn't have any chance of it passing through, but they're going to do it anyway, just because, it's good for their campaign treasury, I suspect.
Well, one of the things that disappoints me too is that a lot of times when I see Rand Paul, who's kind of like one of my heroes there in Congress, and he's giving these speeches and you see nobody around, and I think, oh my gosh, this stuff is so great, so many libertarian principles, and nobody's listening.
And nobody's listening and nobody's watching. Well, that's why nobody's watching, right? Because they don't want to hear it. That's really why they're not watching in Congress. All right, so we're going to move on. The IRS has, they've laid off a bunch of workers, thankfully, and which one is this? Where is this getting from? Anyway, I forget the original from this article where it originally comes from, but shall we say, I don't want to say proletariat, the media class is all upset that the IRS is laid off a bunch of people and now are trying to become more efficient with the use of AI, which actually seems to me that AI is a much fairer way of having people go through your taxes than a human being who's making choices based upon personal preferences rather than what you've programmed it to do. If someone's going to go looking through my tax returns for flags I'd rather have an AI do it rather than a human being. Yeah. Just because an AI is going to do exactly what it was been told to do. It's not going to, decide, I just don't like this person's name, and we're going to throw it up there. Because we've seen what happens in the IRS, that people will, single out people for audits because of who they are or what they say. And this is not a partisan thing. It happens from both parties and all parties and whatnot. So I don't know. I prefer AI being the tax authority rather than some bureaucrat who's got moods.
Well, let me just say that at the beginning of my comments, I think it's unfair that Richard got to talk about sex and we get to talk about the IRS. But I do completely agree with you that AI, it just feels like, this is just people going over forms and checking to see that people have dotted the I's, crossed the T's, and are meeting the rules. And that seems like a job that's suitable for AI and, a computer check. So it almost feels like a little like Scantron, right? I mean, would you really need a person to go over a Scantron, or would you need...
Yeah, you use AI to do a first sift, then you have people look through it, and then you have AI double check the people's work. I mean, that's how you would actually get the most robust and effective, actually IRS review of tax forms. That's how you would actually get the most robust format, but they're not actually interested in the robust format. I swear most of these government agencies are now just jobs programs for bureaucrats. I don't want to get all conspiratorial and say that unions are just trying to pad their union membership, but the bureaucracy is trying to pad the bureaucracy, and anytime you try to get any type of efficiency, they flip out.
Yeah, this does seem like something where, if this is the ideal Doge audit, just simply have AI deal with most of this, and it's much less subject to the corruption that we've already seen when government gets targeted against people that those in power aren't in favor of. So.
Yeah, and we have a long history of this happening regardless of who's in power, right? Yeah. If you cross the people in power, you are going to get audited. It's what happens, And some people, Rush Limbaugh was famous. He got audited every time there was a Democrat in office. And he said, I just knew it. So he said, I didn't have any negative feelings about it. I just knew it was going to happen. So the accountants took care of everything, and we kind of shrugged our shoulders over the whole deal. But you shouldn't really have to face that just because you're don't go along with the current establishment. You are now under threat from an IRS rectal exam. I don't think that's
Well, I almost feel like the bigger scandal here is that we have a tax code that's so complicated that people need to hire people to help them, and that we need artificial intelligence to figure this stuff out. I mean, that's how crazy and complicated this has gotten. So it almost screams to me like, if people are upset about this, maybe we just need a simpler tax code too, so that we literally don't need as many people to go through it.
Yeah, but Jason, you know why we don't have a simpler tax code. It's because they want the control that the tax code gives them. They want to be able to manipulate people's behavior with the tax code. And so you're never going to get a simpler tax code, because that's the goal. That's the real goal of the tax code. They have it collected in a percentage of GDP. It's always between 23, 28%, something like that. I forget which one of those numbers. But no matter what they do with the tax numbers, it always comes out to about the same percentage of GDP. So it's not about the money they bring in. It's about control. That's the real reason we have the complicated tax code.
And I think there's a little bit of optics there too, because people always like to go back to talking about the Kennedy administration, when wealthy people were supposedly paying rates of 80 or 90%. But as you're saying, people never actually paid those rates. There were all kinds of exemptions and deductions, and eventually they worked themselves down to much lower tax rates.
Much lower tax, or they just changed the way they were compensated. That's just. Rich people will always find a way around it, and if they can't, they're just going to pay themselves more and charge their customers more. That's just what's going to happen. So there's a big thing about tariffs and how the end consumer pays all costs of tariffs. Completely true. End consumer pays all costs, period. And whether it's a tariff, whether it's a tax, whether it's a regulatory fee, end consumer pays all of it. So, and we're talking about end consumers now. We're going to move on again. New York City is demanding that Brooklyn landlords pay $100,000 to relocate squatters. The one job government actually should really have, that's to enforce property rights, right? That's the one thing that we all kind of agree to. We send forms down to the government to register our property so that we own it. It's the one thing they should actually be good at. And yet, here we go. You got people who break into a house, trespass, defraud their way into... How many, and these people don't get charged? It's breaking and entering, it's trespassing, and it's fraud. But yet, none of these squatters ever get charged for these things. That's the real problem. And then the freaking landlords, the homeowners, end up having to pay the government $160,000 to clear them out. It's absurd.
Well, it's even worse than that, because as I read into this story, it was actually part of a $400,000 lien that they put against these homeowners. That $160,000 was just to relocate the squatters to another place, which is like absolutely absurd. You're telling me that you have a property right, and if somebody breaks into your house, you have to pay to have them relocated? That's insane. But apparently they had all kinds of electricity bills and other things like that had run up these huge liens or bills that the city had just put liens on the property. And then it's like, oh, surprise, surprise. We didn't enforce the law. We let these guys hang out in your homes for a couple of years, and now you get to pay for everything. And it's just terrible.
It is. It's the kind of the worst. I understand the emotion between wanting to protect renters from abusive landlords. I get it. But if this is your solution, you're not solving the problem. You're just creating more, right? Because you're going to end up getting more abuse because people are not going to rent, or the rents are going to be so high to cover the potential costs that you're not going to be able to afford it. And we wonder why places like New York and San Francisco are literally unaffordable. This is why they're unaffordable.
Yeah. And it's too bad too, because ultimately for libertarians, we like to let the free market help to sort these things out. And a lot of that would be competition and prices, and essentially landlords that do a good job. Those ones, people will want to go into those homes and would be willing to pay more. And those ones that are scary landlords, people would want to get the heck out as fast as possible, and they'd have a hard time filling it back up again. So, but it just seems like we're completely going away from that when we say, no, we need government protection. Well, ultimately, these guys didn't get the protection, the homeowners. It was literally the thieves that got all the protection.
And even slumlords have a place. That's where the cheapest apartments and cheapest rents are. So if you have fallen off the economic ladder and need to get back on, the slumlord is the only place you're going to be able to find that. So even if you get rid of the slumlords, you're actually making it harder to get back on the economic ladder if you've fallen off. And so, as much as none of us like slumlords, they do serve a purpose of creating the lowest of the low housing, So, I don't know. This is your solution to the problem. You've created more of a problem and you haven't solved anything. That's kind of my point on that. So, the Dominican Republic is introduced a bill to regulate freedom of expression. And, you know, the Dominican Republic, they are close to the United States. So not United States, but they are a territory, right? They kind of are under the United States umbrella, but yet we've got this. And it shouldn't surprise us. It was just, a year or so ago where California tried to, essentially make memes illegal if they were political of nature. Mm-hmm. And so we live in a world today where we're talking about the threat of losing our democracy, but you cannot have a democracy if you don't have freedom of speech, don't have freedom of expression. Because if you cannot freely express yourself, if everybody cannot freely express themselves, you don't have a democracy. You've got a controlled something. Right? Give it a name, whatever you want, but it's controlled. And controlled is not democracy. Democracy is ugly. Democracy is messy.
Well, ultimately, so many of these laws wind up being these ill-conceived laws that are trying to protect somebody from being offended. And as I read what it said that the law was about, it was essentially, it claimed it was for freedom of expression, but it said it had exceptions for privacy of children, which, well, maybe. But the other thing that I thought that just struck a chord with me was they said, or if you wind up in violating somebody's dignity, I guess was what it said. And I mean, oh my gosh, that's so broad. I mean, this is essentially like somebody who thinks they have the freedom to not be offended. And that's the problem. Free speech and that do not go together. I mean, people are going to be offended by some other people's ideas, and that's just the way things are. And if you try to control that, you're simply not going to have free speech.
Yeah, well, I think this trying to prevent people from being offended, trying to protect people from being, it's a shell game. It's not really the end goal. The end goal is to control, not to control speech, it's to control thought. Because if you control what people speak, you can control what they think, ultimately, in the long term. I mean, this is the whole Soviet Union and communism is what they actually function on, right? Yeah. You control speech, you control thought. Even if the internal thoughts, you're never going to act it out, and so it doesn't matter. So for the point of control speech, you control thought, you control culture, and you control the country, and that's the ultimate goal.
And as you indicated, I mean, this is not like a scare story or something isolated. I mean, literally in England, they are dealing with this kind of stuff right now, where people are being thrown in jail for jokes. People are literally being thrown in jail for silent prayer. There was a case of a person who was standing a street away from an abortion clinic, and he was silently praying. And now they have these people who I guess are literally inspecting for this kind of stuff. And so they walked over and they asked the guy who was literally like across the street. They said, "What are you doing over here?" And he says, "Well, I'm praying." And they said, "Well, that's against the law." And they literally put the guy in jail and fined him. I mean, absolutely nuts, that's the kind of thing that, what you're thinking in your head is somehow, we're talking about silent prayer. I mean, I can't think of a bigger violation.
The things we are criminalizing, right? Yeah. It's absurd that this is criminalizing, while people who rob, steal, and cause genuine social disruption are essentially treated with kid gloves. And as we talk about moving on, Columbia University had another protest a couple weeks ago, right? And Columbia actually decided to do something unique for the universities. They locked these people in the building, and they wouldn't let them out unless they identified themselves. And then they forcibly removed a few of them. And now these protesters are complaining that the police were being violent. Says, wait a minute, you violently take over a building, because there's no way you can take over a building non-violently. This doesn't happen. It doesn't mean you smashed things or punched people in the face, but intimidation is a form of violence. And that's super intimidating to have a bunch of people come into a library, place where quiet and people are studying, and take over a thing and force people who are trying to study for finals out. Now, it's one thing. You have a right to protest. If you want to stand outside the front gate and have your sign and do your chants, and people have to get into the library through the back door or the side door, I have no problem with that. Knock yourselves out, good to go. But the minute you start preventing people from going around their daily lives, from doing activity which they pay good money to go to do, right? You're now preventing people from exercising their freedom to go about their daily business. Not just an inconvenience to have to walk around and go to the side door. Inconveniences happen every time, right? Yeah. All day, every day, we deal with it. But this is not an inconvenience. This is preventing people from going about their normal routine and with intimidation and force. And that cannot be allowed. I think this is one of these things we need to change.
Yeah, I think ultimately what freedom to protest is about is it is an exercise of your freedom of speech and your freedom of association. And if you are doing anything beyond that, you're probably violating somebody else's rights. And so the way I like to think about it is peaceful protesting essentially requires you to allow others to peacefully pass. And so we see these people blocking freeways sometimes and other things like that. Well, they're essentially holding people hostage. Imagine if there was an ambulance trying to get through and maybe somebody only has minutes to make it to the hospital, and these people don't care. They are literally holding people hostage out there in the commons. And I think that's, in this particular case in Colombia, what they had done is they'd gone into a library building, I believe, where people were studying. People were paying money so that they could study for something of value to them. And these people then decided, hey, what a great place to shout and scream and keep anybody from doing what they're trying to do. Now, you have the quad area that you could do that outdoors, or like you're saying, maybe out on the sidewalk, as long as they're not keeping anybody from being able to pass. Then, you know.
I don't even mind if you prevent people from getting into the main entrance, right, as your protest. You got to go around the side. I don't even mind that. But preventing people from actually doing that, you violated their rights. All right, Jason, we got about 2 minutes, so I want to cover this next one. The careerism that enabled Biden's re-election run is still poisonous to the Democratic Party. And I think this is one of the problems, as we discussed last week. The Democrat Party and Republican Party too, the establishment has far too much power, far too much authority. And and the Biden thing is a perfect example. They didn't allow anybody else to come and try. They didn't allow a real primary run. They didn't allow democracy to run its course. They kind of dictated to it. And this isn't the first time. We saw it in Hillary Clinton's, where the Democrats literally went to court and says, we didn't have to give fair primaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the judge says, yeah, there's no recourse. You're right. Everything you say is correct. They did. They stacked the deck against you while they told you they didn't, but there's no recourse.
Yeah.
The judge literally said that. And so what do you expect when that's the world we live in now?
I do feel like, too, the media is a little bit complicit in this as well. Chuck Todd recently was on television, and he tried to blame this all on the Democrat leaders, the idea that they hid Biden's decline. But, oh my gosh, as we talked about on our Knuckleheads of Liberty show on the last episode we did, they were literally hiding this thing from the beginning. Even Stephen Colbert had a whole piece about Biden just saying crazy stuff at a swimming pool.
Thanks, Jason. We are out of time. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, crew, for working. But most importantly, thank you for watching. See you next week. Please remember to love everybody and have a good night.